Continuing Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment by Jane Roberts, a Seth book. Okay, so the next session that is in this book is 928. There's been some private sessions that they've done in between. This book actually starts to get very sad. Like I've said before, this is the last book before she died. So Seth begins. Now, master events then involve, quote, work or action whose main thrust exists outside of time, yet whose effects are felt within time. Such effects may appear suddenly within time's context, rather than slowly emerge, say, into that framework. It is, of course, that kind of outside of time activity that, in your terms, explains the origin of your universe. There are dimensions of activity, then, that do not appear within time's structure, and developments that happen quite naturally, following different laws of development than those you recognize. It is not just that highly accelerated versions of time can occur at other levels of actuality, but that there are dimensions in which those versions are with no impediments to the natural, quote, flow of events into expression. Your closest approximation will be, again, your experience with time in the dream state, or instances in which complicated problems are suddenly solved for you in dreams, or in other states of consciousness, so that the answers appear full-blown before you. There are, quote, durations, then, that have nothing to do with time as you understand it. Psychological motions that manipulate time but are apart from it. Any sudden emergence of a completed universe would then imply an unimaginable and spectacular development of organization, that it did not just appear from nowhere, but as the, quote, completed physical version, end quote, of an inner, highly concentrated endeavor, the physical manifestation of an inspiration that then suddenly emerges into physical actuality. That kind of activity, that kind of, quote, work, exists behind all of the structures and organizations and experiences with which you are familiar. The world of ideas everywhere permeates physical reality, but ideas, even when they are unexpressed, possess their own organizations, correspondences, their own spheres of motion and development. Master events emerge from that reality of idea now, from which all ideas originate, uniting these through the use of natural correspondences. Every physical manifestation that you know has its non-physical counterpart, in which it is always couched from which it came and to which it will return. Your historical time is, say, but one species of time that dwells upon the earth. There are many others. Time itself emerges from idea, which is itself timeless. So in those terms, there was no point where time began, though such a reference becomes necessary from your own viewpoint. It is probably almost impossible for man to see that he forms the idea of historical context through his own associations and focuses. The heavy, specialized use of so-called rational thought has often caused him to narrow even his neurological recognition of other kinds of experience that might enlarge his view. In dreams, there is greater leeway in that regard. Consciousness becomes more familiar with its own inner motion, and even with the kinds of work and actions it performs outside of its usual waking prejudices. The story of the creation, as biblically stated, is the symbolic representation of a master event, a legend that became its own event, of course, forming about it whole arts and cultures, religions, and disciplines. The same applies to Christianity itself, for all of the seemingly historical events connected with the official Christ did not happen in physical reality. They happened at another level of actuality and were inserted into your time framework, touching a character here, a definitely known historical event there, mixing and merging with the events of the time until the two lines of activity were so entwined that you could not unravel one without unraveling the other. History happened in certain definite forms because of a belief in events that did not, in your world of facts, occur. The main brilliant thrust of those inner events, therefore, splashed out upon the human landscape, propelling peoples and civilizations. The Christ story in the beginning was not nearly as singular and neat as it might now seem, for the finally established official Christ figure was one settled upon from endless versions of a God-man, with which man's psyche has long been involved. He was the psychic composite, the official Christ, carrying within his psychological personage echoes of old and new gods alike, a figure barely begun, to be filled out in time, although originating outside of it. Such master events cause physical events, but they do not emerge originally from them. Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, had his vision. Now, the vision in which Paul not only saw the light of Christ but heard his voice happened in the world of fact. It occurred, but Paul did not see or communicate with a person of divine heritage, sent by his Father to earth, who lived the life of the official Christ and who was crucified. Paul had a vision in response to the needs, desires, and dictates of his own psyche as it was connected to the world of his time, following the patterns of stories about Christ that he had heard that had begun to release within him a great yearning that was, in that vision then, expressed. Christianity for many centuries served as an amazingly creative organizational framework that expressed the vast complexity of the soul's reality. It also, in its way, managed to even focus some of man's less handsome attributes toward ends that were less reprehensible than in the past. Master events of that particular nature bring about a completely new interpretation of historic events. Their intensity, power, and seemingly impelling nature exist precisely because their origins are not physical, but are drawn from the psyche's deepest resources. So that is the end of that session, and there are session notes, and it says here for number 1, here are my notes for the private portion of Monday evening's 927th session. Rob writes, Jane has been very uncomfortable much of the last month. She's still bothered considerably in her arms, legs, knees, and back, especially when trying to sleep at night. I haven't been calling her in the mornings, for they have seemed to be the most peaceful resting times for her. We realize that all of those bodily changes are positive things. I told Jane before the session that her arms are definitely straighter, for example. This afternoon, quote, off and on for almost an hour, end quote, as she put it, her eyesight had improved remarkably as she sat working at her desk. She's missed walking with her typing table lately, yet her steps from her chair to the couch often have been much steadier and better balanced, even though she's still bent way over. When I suggested that tonight's session be about her, she replied, quote, "He'll just say the same things," end quote. So here's Seth on that private session. Seth says, "Now, Rupert's body is trying to right itself. When he lies down, it is trying to straighten out. Nerve patterns are being reactivated, circulation patterns reinforced, muscles contracting and expanding in their own exercises right now in a concentrated, rather intensified bodily commotion. You are used to thinking of any bodily commotion as disruptive and put it in the worst possible light, because your backgrounds have given you little experience in such situations. You, Rupert, or anyone else, largely in your culture. Afterward, however, Rupert does sense certain releases. His steps by the couch are firmer. His back begins to arch more naturally. It is very important that he understand and trust such occurrences. He does feel isolated and frightened sometimes under those conditions. You can be of help in just talking to him or massaging. He can help himself by remembering what I am saying, by exercising gently at such times, and by remembering the miraculous processes within the body that are indeed supporting him. He is also on to some excellent ideas on his own." And the session ends. So session notes continued, number 2. Rob says he suggests a rereading of Chapter 2 for dreams in Volume 1. Now you can get that. I have that in my playlist for Volume 1. And what he's referring to is this part right here. So here's the little number 2. Let me just reread. "Any sudden emergence of a completed universe would then imply an unimaginable and spectacular development of organization. That it did not just appear from nowhere, but as the, quote, completed physical version, end quote, of an inner, highly concentrated endeavor. The physical manifestation of an inspiration that then suddenly emerges into physical actuality." Now, usually when Rob says, "I suggest you reread this," then you're probably better, because he's saying it for a good reason, and I have done that. And every time I'm so happy that I did. So you can do that. Go to the video. So for session note number 4, I'm going to right now, it says, "In the New Testament, see Acts 9, 1-9, wherein Luke, the evangelist, describes the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus. Jane had told me earlier in the week that she didn't think Paul had received a vision or communication from Jesus Christ." So Jane and Rob really aren't Bible readers, just so you know. Jane did go to Catholic school when she was younger, but you know how that goes, and they're not making you read it cover to cover. So kind of interesting. And as you can see right here, during this period, Jane gave 2 regular non-book sessions, plus 48 private sessions, so they have been busy. out of that private total, Seth devoted 25 sessions, either completely or in part, to Jane's sinful self, in quotes. I will explain that in the next video, if you don't already know about it. Jane's health symptoms are declining really fast. And actually, let me just show you right here. We're halfway through the book, and this book looks or seems like a pretty big book. If you look at it like that, I mean, not huge or anything, but there's a lot of notes. You got to take out at least, I don't know, maybe that much right there. Notes, and then the index. So it's about as big as the first one, I'd say. But it is going to start to get really sad. So prepare yourselves for some sad last Seth Jane sessions. Anyone interested in seeing the index, I always, as I'm reading a book, I'm studying the book. First of all, I read it, I study it, and then I read it again. And then sometimes I record it, obviously. But as I'm going through the book, I'm looking up words that I can't easily define. Sometimes I'm shocked because I thought I could define it. So I always do that, and I learn so much in the process. And I always go through the index to make sure that I can quickly go back to this particular topic, to make sure that it is in the index. And if it doesn't have an index, then I will literally create one. And this one actually was pretty good, I'd say. I've had books that were pretty, skimpy on their indexes. But this one wasn't bad. But when I noticed something that needed to be, I don't know, something to do with like writing down helps me remember things better. But, so there's like some things, I don't know if you guys can even see, there's James' sinful self, there's the pages. Going through this tiny little camera. And then if it's like something profound that I feel like, oh my gosh, I have to write this down, I'll have a journal, or if my journal's not right freaking there, then I'll just write it in the book. Unless it's like a first printing, then I probably won't. But yeah, I like to keep notes. I'm not a very good writer. I get excited. I can write prettier. That wasn't very pretty, but got it here. Stuff that is really, really interesting to me. And everybody learns differently, so. Anyways, well, so I will get to the next video as soon as I can.